She washed, cooked, planted, and bled for that land for 40 years, while her brother drank bourbon in the shade of the front porch and called it managing the farm. Clara Hayes was treated like a hired hand inside her own home, ignored in the unspoken inheritance, erased from the family's history. But on a humid March afternoon in 1994, when attorney Arthur Pendleton opened his brown leather briefcase and began reading her father's will out loud, every single person in that room discovered that life has its own unique way of settling the score. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, but anyone who has witnessed injustice within a family up close knows that it could be entirely real. If you enjoy stories that stir the soul, that speak of people who worked in absolute silence while others took the credit, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and let's walk through this story together. Because what happens when Mr. Pendleton reaches the final page is something you won't soon forget. The town of Oak Haven, Georgia, had that particular rhythm that only the rural American South truly understands. The houses with deep front porches and giant pecan trees in the yard, the dirt roads that turned into absolute mud pits during the spring rains, the men who gathered at the counter of Higgins Feed and Seed to talk about cattle, politics, and high school football, strictly in that order. It was a town where everybody knew the neighbor's dog's name, and where a secret lasted at most until the Sunday morning church service. There was a kind of collective surveillance in that place, not necessarily malicious, but constant. People observed, registered, and compared, and they remembered. A small town doesn't forget, even when it pretends to. Hopewell Farm sat about 7 miles outside of town, nestled between rolling hills covered in pasture, and a dense stretch of woods the old-timers called the Hollow. There was a dirt driveway that rose and fell over 2 ridges before reaching the main wooden gate, and on days of heavy rain, that path was a challenge for any truck without 4-wheel drive. But there was a certain beauty to it, a road that forced you to slow down, to pay attention, to respect the land before you even set foot on it. Elias Hayes, Clara's father, had inherited those acres from his own father and had expanded them through sweat and sheer stubbornness over 30 years. It was 600 acres of prime land, part of it planted with corn and soybeans, part of it pasture for the cattle, a sprawling vegetable garden that Clara had tended since she was 12, and a century-old live oak tree in the center of the yard that served as a landmark for anyone coming up the road. You saw the oak before you saw the house. Elias Hayes was a man of few words and a lot of dirt, who woke up before the sun and only went to sleep when the night had completely settled. He wore the marks of a man who lived his entire life outdoors, skin weathered by decades of sun, deep lines around his eyes from a lifetime of squinting against the glare of the fields. He wasn't a man of affection. He didn't hug, he didn't praise, he didn't tell people what he thought of them using direct words. He said it differently, by handing over responsibility, by trusting you with a problem, by including you in a decision. That was his love language, and anyone who didn't understand it could spend their whole life beside Elias Hayes without ever realizing they were loved. He had 2 children with Cecilia, a woman of fiery temperament and an easy laugh who balanced her husband's heavy silence with a presence that filled any room. Cecilia died of a sudden severe fever when Clara was 11 and her brother Wayne was 8. The death was too fast to be processed. A week of high temperature, 2 days of delirium, and then the crushing silence that permanently settled into the space where laughter used to be. Elias Hayes buried his wife on a Monday, and by Friday he was back out in the fields, because that was the only way he knew how to navigate grief, through labor, through the concrete, through what could be touched with his hands. His children were left without a mediator between themselves and the rest of the world. Clara was the oldest, and it was in that 3-year age gap, and in a time when the rural South still lived by the unwritten law that boys are for the world and girls are for the kitchen, that the seed for everything that followed was planted. Wayne grew up hearing that the farm would be his. It wasn't something Elias had explicitly stated. It was more of a silent understanding, the kind that exists without needing to be spoken, floating in the air like dust in a barn and settling over everything. The son inherits the land. The daughter finds a husband to provide for her. That was the code. And Wayne learned that code early on, the same way he learned not to do the heavy lifting, to delegate to the hired hands, to show up at the exact right time and vanish when it was time to sweat. It was such a natural lesson, so deeply absorbed from his environment, that Wayne probably never even identified it as a lesson. To him, that was just the natural order of the universe. Clara, on the other hand, learned a different code, the code of responsibility without recognition, the code of the invisible cornerstone. She was 13 when she took over the kitchen after her mother's passing, not because someone sat her down and said, "It's your turn now." It just happened. Her father didn't cook, her brother was too young, and someone had to keep the wheels turning. Clara kept them turning. She was 15 when she started helping her father with the farm's ledger, because Elias struggled with reading, and Clara had gone further in the town school. By 17, she knew the exact price of a bag of fertilizer, the right weight for a calf to be sold at auction, the name of every single farmhand, and the day each one got paid. She grew up becoming the skeleton of that farm, the internal structure holding everything together, which no one ever saw, but without which the whole business would collapse. And as is the case with skeletons, no one comments on them as long as the body is standing upright. They'd only notice if she were gone. Wayne Hayes had a very specific talent, the talent for looking good. Whenever buyers or guests arrived at the farm, he was the first one out the door, hand extended, bright smile, voice deep and confident. "Leave it to me, sir. Here at Hopewell, we take care of it." People drove away with the distinct impression that they had just met a highly capable young rancher. Clara would stay in the kitchen or the office, figuring out how to deliver what Wayne had just promised, without a clue of how to actually do it. It was a scene that repeated itself with slight variations over the years. Wayne would promise a cattle delivery by a certain date, or shake hands on a soybean deal down at the local tavern, and then appear before Clara with the look of someone asking a tiny favor. "Hey, Clara, I need you to double-check that thing with the buyer from Atlanta." And Clara checked it, she resolved it, she saved him, and she never told a single soul that she had done it. When Elias began to age, his knees aching, his eyesight fading, his memory slipping, it was Clara who started attending the agricultural co-op meetings, dealing with the suppliers, and signing the payroll checks every Friday afternoon. Wayne, on those days, was usually in town. Sometimes at Mac's Tavern, sometimes at barbecues on neighboring farms, where his knack for business was famous, even if the businesses themselves rarely materialized. Over time, the older farmhands learned not to wait for Wayne's orders on anything that actually mattered. They waited for Miss Clara. She knew their kids' names, she knew whose wife was sick, she knew when the harvest was on track and when they needed to pivot. That knowledge wasn't accidental. It was built, cultivated, the result of years of paying attention to the things most people preferred to ignore. The neighbors in Oakhaven had their opinions about the Hayes family, just like they did about everything. The observant ones knew the truth. "That Clara is the one running the whole show over there," Mr. Higgins would comment from behind the counter at the feed store, since he was the one who saw who actually came in to pay the bills. But the opinions of observant folks didn't change reality, and Clara never asked them to. She simply carried on. By the time she was 30, Clara had turned down 2 marriage proposals, one from a nice young man from a respectable town family, another from a distant cousin who owned orchards up in Tennessee. She didn't turn them down for lack of feeling. She turned them down because her father was getting old, because Wayne was useless, and because who would keep the farm from going under if she left? That was her reasoning, whispered to herself, in the quiet hours of the morning when sleep wouldn't come. She stayed, and over time she stopped questioning that decision, the same way you stop looking at a scar that's been there for decades. It becomes part of the landscape, part of who you are, and asking if it should be there feels like a pointless question. Wayne married Brenda Carver in 1979. She was the daughter of a local car dealership owner, a woman with a reputation for having a good head for business, which in practice meant she knew the price tag of everything and the value of absolutely nothing. Brenda arrived at Hopewell Farm like a conquering general taking possession of a territory. She took a mental inventory of every piece of furniture, every head of cattle, every acre of land, and from day one she treated Clara with that cold southern politeness of someone who knows the other person is merely an obstacle. "Oh, Clara, bless your heart. You didn't have to go to all this trouble," Brenda would say when her sister-in-law set dinner on the table, in a tone that sounded like gratitude but reeked of condescension. "This is just too heavy for my diet, take it away." Or she would say, "My goodness, Clara, are you still messing with that farm paperwork? Why don't you let Wayne handle the finances? You go rest." And Wayne, sitting right next to his wife, would nod in agreement, a man who couldn't find the cattle registry if Clara didn't physically place it in his hands. Brenda possessed a highly specific skill, the ability to make Clara feel like she was taking up too much space in her own home. It was subtle, built on microaggressions, a passing comment about Clara's faded apron, a suggestion that it was men's work to deal with the bank, a sideways glance that evaluated and immediately dismissed. There was never a shouting match. Brenda was far too clever for that. There was only the constant accumulation of tiny humiliations, like a dripping faucet eroding a rock, not by the force of the impact, but by the sheer patience of repetition. Clara had learned not to react, not out of weakness, but because there was a much larger war worth fighting, and Brenda Carver wasn't it. The years rolled on with the quiet cruelty that only time possesses. Elias Hayes slowly lost his strength. In 1988, a severe stroke left him with slurred speech, and the right side of his body paralyzed. Clara became her father's full-time nurse, managing his pills, driving him to specialists in Atlanta, changing his bandages, overseeing the physical therapist who came to the house every Tuesday and Thursday. It meant endless hours in hospital waiting rooms, filling out forms, making life-or-death decisions under immense pressure. Clara memorized the name of every medication, the exact dosages, the warning signs that required an immediate ER visit. She learned to read her father's condition by the color of his complexion in the morning, by the quality of his sleep, by the strength of his grip when she walked past his bed. She knew him with the deep, visceral intimacy of someone who cares for another person's failing body. Not just on the surface, but in the gritty details that most people lack the stomach or the patience to handle. Wayne would show up on occasional Sundays, usually when he didn't have a golf game or a hangover to nurse. He'd stay for 30 minutes, shout at the old man as if a paralyzed arm meant he was also deaf, promise to finally sort out that property line deed, and then vanish for another week. The promise about the deed was a running joke. There was a disputed strip of land with a neighboring farmer that needed legal sorting, and Wayne used that task as his eternal excuse for being incredibly busy. Years passed. The deed was never sorted. Clara finally fixed it herself in 1991, hiring a lawyer in Macon and driving the paperwork through to the end. Wayne only showed up to sign his name on the dotted line, looking immensely proud of himself. Elias observed all of this with eyes that were still perfectly sharp, even if his mouth could no longer form the words his brain was screaming. The stroke had stolen his speech with surgical cruelty. He understood everything, felt everything, wanted to say everything, but the words came out jumbled, half-formed, useless. Yet, there was something in the old man's eyes that Clara had learned to decipher over the years, a mixture of heavy guilt and unbreakable determination. She never asked. It wasn't in her nature to demand from her father the recognition that life had denied her. She just cared for him. But there were nights when Elias would hold his daughter's hand much longer than necessary, and in that grip there was something far deeper than gratitude. It was the urgent communication of a man who knows the clock is ticking down and that the words he has left are nowhere near big enough for what needs to be said. What Clara didn't know, what no one knew except for Arthur Pendleton, Elias's trusted attorney since 1971, was that the old farmer had drafted a will. Not the obvious will the whole town expected, the one where the golden boy inherited the empire, and the spinster daughter got a little something, a vague phrase that practically meant crumbs to avoid a lawsuit. Elias Hayes had written a completely different will, one that he had revised and tightened 3 separate times over the years, each version more ironclad than the last, every clause drafted with Mr. Pendleton's patient help during long afternoons locked in the farm's office, while Clara was out sweating in the sun, or in town fixing whatever mess Wayne had left behind. Lawyer Pendleton was a man in his late 60s, short in stature, with a head of thick white hair and heavy-rimmed glasses he'd worn since his 30s. He kept an office just off Oak Haven's town square, lined with dark mahogany bookshelves overflowing with yellowed case files, and he possessed a reputation for absolute discretion that was worth its weight in gold. The man knew more of the county's sins than the local reverend, and unlike the reverend, he was under no divine obligation to keep them. He kept them by choice, understanding that his power relied entirely on his silence. He had been a witness to it all over the decades: shredded inheritances, farms gambled away, marriages of convenience to cover up debts. But Elias Hayes's will was, in all his years of practice, one of the most meticulously bulletproof documents he had ever placed in his briefcase. Not because of its legal complexity, but because of its brutal moral clarity. Every single word was there on purpose, hand-picked, weighed on a scale before it was committed to ink. Elias Hayes drew his last breath on a Monday in February 1994, in the early hours of the morning, with Clara holding his hand. He was 73. It was a quiet death, the kind that feels like sleep just pulling you a little further under. His breathing spaced out, grew shallower, and simply stopped. Clara sat on the edge of the bed for a long time afterward, refusing to let go of his hand, listening to the heavy, dense silence that had flooded the room. Then she stood up, turned on the hallway light, and went to the kitchen to brew a pot of coffee, because that's what you did. Half the county showed up to the funeral. Elias was a respected man, and his death marked the end of an era. Wayne stood next to the casket with his chest puffed out, already rehearsing his role as the new lord of the manor. Brenda wore a designer black dress that probably cost the equivalent of a farmhand's 2-month salary. Clara stood quietly at the foot of the casket until the very last second. When the funeral directors began to close the lid, she pressed her forehead against the polished wood for just a fraction of a second, a gesture so small and intimate that almost no one saw it. Almost. A week after the burial, Lawyer Pendleton called the farm and requested that both children and the daughter-in-law be present the following Thursday at exactly 3 p.m. for the reading of the last will and testament. The March sky over Oakhaven was a heavy, bruised grey, threatening a downpour it refused to deliver. The heat was muggy and sticky, the kind that glues your shirt to your back and sets everyone's nerves on edge. Wayne and Brenda arrived at the farm early, much earlier than Wayne's usual lazy schedule allowed, which was already a glaring sign that they had been scheming. Brenda wore a crisp pink blouse and tailored white slacks, her blonde hair pulled back in a style that, in the 90s South, screamed country club. She swept her eyes across the living room as she greeted Clara, taking that same silent inventory as always, but this time with a glint of absolute possession in her eyes, like someone counting the cash they're about to put in their wallet. In Brenda's mind, it was a done deal. It was just a matter of signing some paperwork, thanking the lawyer, and confirming what destiny and good old tradition had already ordained. "Mr. Pendleton should be here right at 3. He's always punctual," Clara said, pouring coffee into mugs at the dining room table. She was still wearing her work apron, having spent the entire morning balancing the farm's ledger books, the exact same books that soon, according to everyone's logic, would be handed over to Wayne. "Though you can go ahead and take that old apron off, Clara," Brenda said with a saccharine smile. "You look like the hired help." There was a split second of absolute silence. Clara looked at her sister-in-law with that heavy, leaden calm that is only forged after decades of swallowing insults. She didn't answer. She calmly untied the knot, folded the apron, and laid it over the back of a chair. It was the precise movement of someone who has learned that some battles are so pitiful they aren't even worth the oxygen required to speak. Lawyer Pendleton arrived at 3 on the dot. He carried the brown leather briefcase Clara had seen before. He used it strictly for matters of grave importance, the dark, worn leather giving it an air of undeniable authority. He greeted everyone with the dry efficiency of a man who has performed this theatre hundreds of times, accepted a cup of black coffee, and took a seat at the head of the large oak dining table Elias had used for serious business. The table was covered in the scars of real life, a white ring where someone had left a hot mug too long, a gouge on the edge that no one remembered making, the marks of labor. Wayne and Brenda sat opposite him. Clara remained standing near the window, as if she wasn't entirely sure she had the right to take a seat. "Please, Clara, have a seat," the lawyer said, in a tone that wasn't a request. She sat down. Mr. Pendleton opened the briefcase slowly. He pulled out a large manila envelope, then a stapled document of several pages, and finally a smaller white envelope with Clara's name written on the front in handwriting. He arranged them on the table with the methodical care of someone who knows the exact blast radius of the bomb he is about to detonate. "Before we begin," he started, adjusting his thick glasses on the bridge of his nose, "I want to inform all parties present that this will was drafted, notarized and filed with the county clerk, with its final revision taking place in November of 1993. It is absolutely ironclad and valid from a legal standpoint. There will be no procedural surprises. Only surprises in the content." That last sentence hung in the humid air of the room. Wayne let out a short, nervous chuckle, the kind meant to mask sudden anxiety. Brenda clasped her hands together on the table, her knuckles whitening. Pendleton began to read. The first pages were standard legal boilerplate: identification of the testator, dates, notary seals, the inventory of the estate. He read in a slow, measured baritone, fully aware that every comma carried weight. Wayne listened while rubbing his hands together, waiting to get to the good part. Brenda listened with razor-sharp focus, her mental calculator converting every tractor, every cow, and every acre into dollar signs. Clara listened with her hands resting quietly in her lap, her eyes focused on the grain of the wood table. She wasn't expecting a miracle. Over the years she had built a kind of armored peace inside her chest. It wasn't the resignation of a martyr. It was something harder and more dignified. She knew how much she had sweat for this farm. She knew the value of her early mornings. She knew the dirt recognized her hands. The herd responded to her voice, and the foreman came to her before making any real decisions. If her father hadn't given her her rightful place in life, at least she had the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, the pride of someone who never had to beg for a damn thing. Or at least, that's what she forced herself to believe. The lawyer reached the primary clause. He took a breath. Regarding the property known as Hopewell Farm and all its assets, including land, structures, livestock and agricultural equipment, the testator, Elias Hayes, determines the following. He paused. Wayne leaned forward like a hunting dog on point. The silence lasted only 2 seconds, but it felt like an hour. The entirety of the property known as Hopewell Farm, comprising its 600 acres, is hereby bequeathed to my daughter, Clara Hayes, in absolute recognition of the labor, sacrifice and loyalty she has given to this family and this land throughout her entire adult life. The silence that crashed into the room had physical weight. It was a thick, suffocating silence that filled the space between them like smoke. Brenda was the first to react. Her spine snapped straight. The condescending smile vanished from her face like a light being switched off. Wayne sat with his mouth half open. His jaw trembled. He blinked rapidly, twice, 3 times. He stared at the lawyer with wide eyes, expecting the next sentence to be a joke, a typo, or hoping the world where he was king would suddenly snap back into place. Clara didn't move a muscle. She sat petrified, her eyes glued to the table, her heart pounding in a way she didn't recognize. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was a feeling much older and far more painful than either of those. It was a head-on collision with a truth she had forbidden herself to hope for, and which had just been dropped squarely into her lap. Mr. Pendleton kept reading, completely unfazed. To my son, Wayne Hayes, I leave the sum of $50,000 deposited in an account at the First National Bank of Oakhaven, as well as the residential property located at 42 Elm Street, where he and his family may reside. Wayne jumped to his feet. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a violent, ugly screech. "What the hell is this?" His voice cracked, high-pitched and furious. The old man was out of his mind. This is the will of a crazy old fool who didn't know what he was doing. "Wayne," Pendleton's voice dropped an octave, cold as ice. "I advise you to sit down. I am not finished. You don't need to finish a damn thing. This is highway robbery. It's not valid. I'm going to contest this. I'm going to sue—" "Wayne." This time it was Clara who spoke his name, softly, with the low, heavy voice of a woman who was used to putting out everyone else's fires. Her brother whipped his head around to look at her, and in that look several things collided. Rage, obviously, but also an undeniable flash of shame. the cowardly recognition of someone who always knew, deep down in his gut, that the day of reckoning was eventually going to come. He slumped back into his chair. "With your permission," the lawyer resumed, "I will now read the statement of justification provided by the testator. This is not legally required for probate, but Elias Hayes left strict instructions that it be read aloud in the presence of his children." He cleared his throat and began. "I write this with whatever clarity of mind I have left, and with the clear conscience of a man who spent his life trying to figure out what is right. I was raised in an era where the law of men said the son inherits the kingdom, and I was foolish enough to believe it for far too long. I was blind to my daughter Clara's sweat for many years, not out of malice but out of habit, and sometimes habit is worse than malice, because it makes you blind to who you are stepping on." Pendleton's reading slowed slightly. He too was giving voice to these words for the first time in front of the family, and the ink carried a different weight when spoken aloud. Clara Hayes woke up before the roosters and went to bed bone-tired for this farm since she was a 13-year-old girl. She learned to read contracts with the brokers when my eyes went bad. She fought for the price of the harvest and the cattle when I was bedridden. She cleaned me and cared for me when I couldn't care for myself, and she never, ever asked for a dime in return, and that is exactly why she deserves every last inch of it. Brenda's lips were pressed into a thin, white line. Her hands, previously relaxed, were now balled into tight fists on her knees. Her entire body was rigid. She was using every ounce of willpower she possessed to avoid throwing a screaming fit right then and there. "To my son Wayne, I leave what I can with a father's love intact. But I cannot leave him an empire that was built on the calluses and blood of another person. It would be a slap in the face to God and to Clara, and it would be a curse to Wayne himself, because land you didn't sweat for is land you won't know how to keep." Mr. Bay. Pendleton lowered the pages. "It bears the signature of the testator, the signatures of 2 appropriate witnesses, and the official seal of the county notary, dated November 12th, 1993. "There is one more thing," the lawyer said, picking up the smaller white envelope. "Your father instructed me to hand this to you personally, Clara, in front of the others, but with the instruction that you read it in private if you prefer." He held out the envelope. Clara took it with both hands. She felt the texture of the paper. Her name was written in her father's shaky, heavy handwriting, the script of a hard-working man who struggled to hold a pen, the strokes pressed down so hard it was as if he wanted to carve the letters into the paper so they'd never fade. "I'll read it later," she murmured, slipping it into her pocket. Wayne stood up again, more controlled this time, but vibrating with pure impotence. "I'm calling my lawyers in Atlanta. This is going to court." "That is your constitutional right," Lawyer Pendleton replied, not blinking an eye. "But it is my duty to inform you that this will is backed by medical affidavits from 2 board-certified neurologists confirming Elias Hayes was of entirely sound mind and body when he signed it. You can file a lawsuit tomorrow morning if you wish, but your chances of a judge ruling in your favor are absolutely 0. Brenda grabbed her designer purse with a sharp jerk. "Let's go, Wayne. We have nothing left to do here." They walked out. The front door closed, not with a dramatic slam, but with the hollow thud of wounded pride. Their hurried footsteps echoed on the porch, the truck engine roared to life, and a cloud of red dust kicked up down the driveway. And then the house sank back into the heavy peace of the afternoon. Mr. Pendleton began sliding his papers back into his briefcase with the reverence of a man who respects documents that alter destinies. "Clara," he said without looking up. "Yes, Mr. Pendleton." "Your father confessed to me once that his greatest regret in life would be taking so damn long to open his eyes to what was standing right in front of him." She said nothing. Her fingers gripped the envelope inside her pocket. "Take good care of Hopewell," the old lawyer said softly. "You already know how." Clara waited until the lawyer's car disappeared over the ridge. She waited until the late afternoon sun began to dip, and the shadows of the oak tree stretched across the yard. She waited until the silence of the farm was absolute, the kind of silence that tells you no one else is going to walk through the door. Then she walked to the bedroom where her father had slept for 40 years. It was a sparse room, an iron bed frame, a firm mattress, a wooden cross on the wall, and a black-and-white studio portrait taken in Atlanta back in the 60s, when she was a toddler and Wayne wasn't even a thought. In the photo, Elias wore his only good suit, and Cecilia wore a floral dress and a pearl necklace Clara never saw again. They were both smiling with that stiff posture of country folks, unaccustomed to cameras. Clara stared at her parents for a long time before she tore open the envelope. The letter was 2 pages long, written in blue ink, with smudges in certain spots that she couldn't tell if were caused by her father's trembling hand or by tears falling on the page. Clara, my girl, if you are reading this, it means I've gone to meet my maker, and you were left to hold up the world, which is how our luck always played out. I want to ask for your forgiveness in the only way I know how, because a man of my raising and my era never learned how to apologize face to face, and that is a cross I'm taking to my grave. You never complained, and out of pure comfort, I used your silence as an excuse to play blind. I told myself my girl is strong, she's made of iron, she doesn't need me to pat her on the back. But everybody needs a hug, Clara. You needed it, and I denied it to you. This farm is yours by the grace of God. It was always yours by the sweat of your brow. Now it is yours on the county's papers too. Take care of it the way you know how, with honor, and don't take crap from anyone. But above all, take care of yourself, which is the part I forgot to teach you. You spent your whole life taking care of us. Learn to let yourself be loved. Learn to receive. With love from the father who realized things too late, Elias. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, frozen. The room still smelled like him. Black tobacco, liniment for his bad knees, and damp earth, the scent of the man who raised her, which would soon fade away, replaced by the sterile smell of a dead man's room. She didn't cry right away. The tears came later, slowly, with the silent, suffocated weeping of someone who was taught to swallow the lump in her throat, because there's no time for crying on a farm. But when the dam finally broke, it came from the deepest, darkest corner of her soul, the place where you hide the pains that rot, because they are never spoken. It wasn't just grief for her father. It was the brutal, overwhelming release of a woman who had carried the cross of a nameless injustice, and who, all at once, was finally allowed to set it down. The gossip about the will took exactly 48 hours to spread across Oakhaven. For things like that, a small town is faster than a telegraph. Down at Higgins Feed and Seed, it was the only topic of conversation for a week. As always, the town split into 2 camps. There were the old-school traditionalists who swore Old Man Hayes had lost his marbles, that his spinster daughter had brainwashed him, and that Wayne had been robbed blind. But there was a massive wave of people, mostly those who actually knew how the real world worked, who were firmly on Clara's side. "What are you all so shocked about? Clara's been wearing the pants out there for a decade," Mr. Higgins declared while ringing up a bag of dog food. "Wayne would come in here trying to pay with bounced checks, and Miss Clara was the one who'd march in and settle the tab with hard-earned cash. Over at Mrs. Gable's diner, the local women gossiped with that mixture of envy and respect the South reserves for women who break the mold. 40 years breaking her back on that hill, honey. 40. Do you think Wayne's gonna sue her? They say his lawyer told him he could try, but that paper is locked up tighter than a drum." Wayne, stubborn as ever, drove up to Atlanta to consult a fancy law firm. They reviewed the documents, charged him a hefty consultation fee, and confirmed exactly what Arthur Pendleton had warned. The will was a fortress. Suing would be financial suicide. He'd waste years of his life and thousands of dollars just for a judge to laugh him out of court. Wayne and Brenda had to swallow their pride and move into the house on Elm Street. They used the $50,000 to remodel it, and while they objectively lived better than 80% of Oakhaven, Brenda could never walk through the front door without feeling like she was living on the scraps of what she was owed. The resentment turned to acid in her mouth. At church potlucks, she would spew venom with the refined elegance of a Southern belle. "Bless my poor sister-in-law's heart. She's an old maid, no children to call her mother, locked up in that giant farmhouse all by herself. I don't know if her daddy did her a favor or sentenced her to purgatory." People listened. Some nodded just to avoid a fight. But most people looked out toward Hopewell Farm, and what they saw was very different from the tragic soap opera Brenda was trying to sell them. In the first few months after becoming the sole owner, Clara did something that baffled everyone. Nothing. She threw no parties, she didn't sponsor a church picnic, she didn't parade around the town square. She simply woke up the morning after the reading, put the kettle on, drank her black coffee and saddled her horse to go check on a pest problem in the lower cornfields. That was what she knew how to do. That was what kept her alive. But soon, things began to change. She hired 3 more farmhands. The farm desperately needed extra muscle that Wayne had never hired because he was too busy spending the payroll money on himself. She had the barn roofs replaced, fixing rot that had been there for years. She drove into town, sat across from the bank manager, and secured an agricultural loan to bring 20 head of purebred Angus into the pastures. These were decisions that had been suffocating in her throat for years. The feeling was strange. It wasn't the explosive freedom you see in the movies. It was a heavy, quiet freedom. The sacred right to give orders without asking permission, to make a mistake without enduring a lecture, to succeed without someone else pinning the medal on their own chest. One afternoon in late April, a girl named Sarah showed up at the farm's gate. She was the daughter of a tractor driver who had worked for Elias and died in a rollover accident years ago. Sarah was 18, 6 months pregnant, and carrying a cardboard box tied with twine. Her husband, a miserable man twice her age, had completely washed his hands of her when he found out about the baby and kicked her to the curb. Desperate, she remembered her father speaking kindly of the Hayes family and walked all the way to the farm. Clara went out to meet her. She didn't ask humiliating questions. She pointed her to the back bedroom near the kitchen, put her to work helping with the crew's meals, and when Sarah's water broke, it was Clara who stayed up all night with her, boiling water, calling the town midwife, and holding her hand while she screamed. They named the boy Little Eli. When the gossip reached town, folks waited to see what would happen. Brenda, naturally, didn't miss her chance on the church steps. That woman has lost her mind, bringing trash and bastards into the family home. And she's a single woman. What an absolute disgrace to the Hayes name. Mrs. Gable, a formidable woman in her 70s who had been good friends with Cecilia, stepped right up to Brenda with the authority of a 4-star general. A disgrace is stealing, Brenda, or acting like a buzzard waiting for your father-in-law to die so you can pick his bones clean. That girl has more decency in her pinky finger than some cowards have in their whole body. Brenda clamped her jaw shut and walked away very quickly. It was a hot afternoon in July when Silas Vance stood at the gate of Hopewell Farm. He had arrived in Oakhaven a few weeks prior, stepping off a Greyhound bus with an old leather duffel bag and a heavy steel toolbox. He had come down from Macon looking for work, after the tractor plant where he worked went bankrupt, leaving 200 families out on the street overnight. He was 42, a widower with no children. He had buried his wife after a brutal battle with cancer that ate up his savings and his joy. Left alone in a quiet house surrounded by ghosts and medical bills, he sold what little he had left and hit the road with no particular destination. He was a solidly built man, with giant calloused hands accustomed to taming iron and fighting the dirt. Silver was already dusting his temples. He had a deep, quiet look in his eyes, not the look of ignorance, but the profound calm of a man who has walked through hell, realized it didn't kill him, and decided to just keep walking. Somebody at the local diner told him Miss Clara was hiring folks she could trust. So he walked up the hill. Clara was inspecting a fence line when he arrived. She looked him up and down, just like she did with any hand looking for work. She checked his hands, his scuffed but clean work boots, his straight posture. No nonsense, she thought. You know your way around cattle and dirt? She asked dryly. Yes, ma'am. Grew up working the fields till I was 18 before I went to work the steel at the plant. I know fencing. I know the milking lines, and I can do basic vet work if it don't involve surgery. Why'd you leave the plant? They closed the doors, went bankrupt and threw us all out. Clara liked the bluntness. No sob stories, no playing the victim, no trying to butter her up. Go find Ben, the foreman. He'll tell you where your bunk is and what time we start. Ben, who had been running crews at Hopewell for 15 years and knew his boss better than anyone, put Silas on the payroll. And in the months that followed, that quiet outsider slowly carved out a different space for himself on the farm. Not by doing backflips, but by doing the ordinary work with a level of dedication you rarely saw anymore. He was the first to saddle up and the last to put his tools away. When a water pump broke down, he didn't go whining to the boss. He took it apart, fixed it, and only let her know if they needed to buy a replacement part. One afternoon, Clara walked past the stables and noticed that the rotting barn door that had been sagging for months now had brand new hinges and was reinforced with freshly sanded wood. "Who fixed this, Ben?" she asked. "Silas did, ma'am. Said it was a damn shame looking at it hang like that, so he fixed it on his lunch break." She nodded without saying another word. But deep inside her chest something clicked. The same way parched earth recognizes the first drop of rain in May, Clara registered the value of a man who repaired what was broken without asking for applause. The conversations between Clara and Silas began the way real things begin in the country, through the rhythm of the work, without hidden motives. He'd take off his hat to give her the daily report. She'd give the orders. And sometimes the conversation stretched a few minutes longer. Silas asked about the history of the land with genuine curiosity, not the interest of a broker looking to buy, but the interest of a farmer respecting the soil he's standing on. "Did you plant this whole row of corn, Miss Clara?" he asked her one drizzly afternoon, running his rough fingers over the green stalks with a gentleness that contrasted with his size. "I did. I seeded this ridge back in the 80s. My daddy planted the bottom land down by the creek. It's a real strong yield. You've got a good hand for it." Clara stared at him. There was not a trace of flattery in his voice. It was the assessment of a working man recognizing the work of another. "You know your corn? Learned a bit up near the mountains years ago. You pick up a few tricks." Clara didn't smile. She wasn't one to hand out smiles easily, but the hardness in her eyes softened in that almost imperceptible way that happens when two lonely souls recognize each other. Time did what time does. She started noticing what time he was down by the pens. She noticed how he treated little Eli, Sarah's boy, with a gentle patience, never forcing the kid, just letting him be, teaching him how to tie a knot with slow, deliberate movements. Once she saw him carrying the boy on his shoulders as they walked to the water trough. It was such a normal, insignificant image to the rest of the world, but Clara stood frozen, watching them far longer than necessary. She didn't dare ask herself what she was feeling, until one August morning, with the crickets chirping loudly outside her window, the truth hit her so clearly she had to sit up in bed. She was 41 years old. She had dried up her youth preserving the honor of a family that saw her as a piece of furniture. And now, when the legal papers had finally handed her justice, she found herself scanning the horizon for the straw hat of a man who talked to the crops. God has an ironic sense of humor, she thought, but it wasn't cruel. It was the divine patience of someone who knows the sweetest fruit takes the longest to ripen. The town knew before they did. That's just how small towns work. Miss Clara's got a different look about her. Even walks a little lighter, don't you think? Mr. Higgins mentioned to his wife. Ben, the foreman, noticed that Silas had bought white paint to fix up his bunkhouse room, repaired the little window, and even hung a potted plant. "A man who hangs plants on his porch is a man putting down roots," Ben joked in the kitchen. Brenda, ever faithful to her own bitterness, launched her dart after Sunday service. All that ambition to steal the farm from her own brother just to end up tangled up with a common farmhand. If her daddy could see her, he'd drop dead all over again. But the Oakhaven of 1994 wasn't the Oakhaven of their grandparents. Mrs. Gable turned around, adjusting her shawl, and shot her down. "Dead of what, Brenda? From seeing his daughter happy. Poor Elias Hayes probably died of a broken heart, realizing late as it was that the golden boy he bragged about wasn't worth the dirt on his boots. Lord bless you, Brenda. Jealousy ages a woman terribly." By October, with the fields painted in autumn gold, Clara decided to throw a harvest party. Elias used to do it in his prime, but it had been years since they had roasted a pig at Hopewell. It wasn't to show off. It was an act of resurrection, a notice that the farm was more alive than ever. There was barbecue, cornbread, sweet tea, and coolers full of cold beer. Ben brought out his fiddle and played some bluegrass. Little Eli ran between the horse's legs, covered in dirt and absolute joy. Silas was there, leaning against a porch pillar in a clean plaid shirt and polished boots. And at that party, the only difference that mattered took place. He and Clara didn't talk about cows or fences or vaccines. They talked about life, about how they missed their mother's peach cobbler. about how taking beatings from life calluses your heart but doesn't turn it to stone, about which sunsets were the prettiest in the south. As the evening fell, the fire under the smoker dying down and the sky turning that fiery orange that warns of November chills, Silas stepped close to her, choosing his words carefully, as if holding embers in his hands. "Miss Clara, can I ask you a straight question?" "Go ahead, Silas." "Are you going to stay out here forever? Is your whole life just going to be spent being the boss?" She fixed her gaze on the darkening hills. She understood everything the question was hiding. Country folks have their own language for talking about love without sounding foolish. "This farm is my blood," she answered, her voice steady. "But lately I've been thinking that there's room in this life for more than just work and livestock." Silas nodded slowly. He adjusted the brim of his hat. "For that's right. Sometimes life gives you a second act." There were no violin swelling, no dramatic declarations on bended knee, no movie kisses, just two grown adults, bruised by life, realizing that when you finally find a safe harbor, there's no rush to set sail again. Wayne dragged his resentment around for a few more years, but venom, when it doesn't kill you, leaves you with a hangover called regret. 3 years after the reading of the will on a random afternoon, he showed up at the gates of Hopewell. He was alone. Clara met him on the porch, offered him a glass of iced tea, and waited. "Just came to see how the place was doing," Wayne murmured, looking down at his boots. "Looks real good." They sat in silence. It wasn't an awkward silence, but the vast canyon between two siblings who share too much history to pretend nothing happened. "The old man was right, Clara," he blurted out suddenly, swallowing hard. "It hurts like hell to admit it, but he wasn't wrong." Clara studied him. She saw a man who had aged rapidly, exhausted from carrying the weight of a useless entitlement, stripped of the cardboard throne he had been seated on since childhood. "This is your home, Wayne," she told him. "The gates are open whenever you want to visit. This land carries your name, too." He nodded. He stood up and walked to his truck. Clara watched him disappear down the dirt road, and then she went back inside to review the monthly expenses with Ben. Clara kept running the show. Hopewell Farm became famous across the state. She started producing an artisan preserve and cheese line that ended up in high-end restaurants in Atlanta. A little side business that started because a passing surveyor got a flat tire. Clara gave him some cheese and jam, and the recipe did the rest. Sarah stayed on for several years. Little Eli grew up calling Clara Auntie, and on his 10th birthday, he got a shiny red bicycle that made him the envy of Oak Haven. Later, Sarah met a good truck driver from Macon, and Clara gave her blessing for her to move on and build her life, on the one condition that Eli spent all his summers at the farm. Silas Vance went from being the new hand to the silent pillar of the farm. There was no courthouse wedding, no big church ceremony. At their age, a piece of paper felt like a bad joke cooked up by lawyers. But all of Oak Haven and the surrounding counties knew exactly who Silas was at Hopewell. They knew that if Miss Clara drove up to Athens for business, the man giving the orders with the exact same authority was him, and he knew it. He knew he wasn't there because he was a freeloader, but because he was the man the boss of the world had chosen to share her front porch with. The white envelope with Elias's shaky handwriting stayed locked in the cedar drawer of the desk. Sometimes, on nights when the thunderstorms rolled in and the smell of wet earth woke up the ghosts of her memory, Clara would open the drawer, take out the letter, and simply hold the paper. She could feel the ridges where her father had pressed the pen. She didn't need to read it. She knew it by heart. Learn to receive. And she was learning. Slowly, with the clumsiness of someone who was only ever taught to give until she was empty. But she was learning. Learning to let herself be held in the cold early mornings, learning to let someone else worry about the leaky roof, learning to wake up without her chest tight with anxiety. In the American South, the story of Clara Hayes became one of those legends you discuss over a slice of pie and black coffee. Not as cheap gossip, but as a life lesson. Clara's name became the example grandmothers use when they want to explain to their granddaughters that hard, honest work always bears fruit, that God doesn't ignore anyone's sweat, and that keeping your head down doesn't mean you're a coward. And when justice finally arrived, even if it was delivered by a notary and a regretful old man, She received it with the dignity of someone who always knew that a piece of paper doesn't define your worth. It simply forces everyone else to accept what the dirt already knew. This story is fiction, but the Claras of the world exist. They existed in the past, and they are breathing right now in your town, in your city, and maybe even in your own family. They are the women who are the foundation of the house, the ones who take the food off their own plate to feed others, the ones who hold up the walls when the men crumble, the ones who carry the heavy burdens without ever asking for a statue to be built in their honor. They are the ones who, at the end of the day, hold your hand in your darkest moment. And every once in a while, life has the decency and the divine justice to read the will out loud and say their names, clearly, so that the whole world has to shut up and listen. Tell me down in the comments, have you ever known a woman like Miss Clara? Someone who broke her back in silence her whole life and whose justice arrived when she least expected it? And what do you think? Did Elias Hayes do the right thing, or did he wait until he had one foot in the grave to fix his mistake? I read every single comment because this channel is built on the stories that you recognize out there in the real world. If this story brought a lump to your throat or reminded you of someone, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell and share this video. Because honest work always brings a reward. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but time has a long memory and it never forgets a debt. I'll see you next week with another story from the heartland that's going to leave you thinking. Until then, fictional story created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, farms, or real-life events is purely coincidental.